and for those who will certainly be coming, thank you for your time today, wherever you are in the world. My name is Justin Reach, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society, and I'm the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center, which is where I am here at George Washington University. Before I introduce my guest, I'd like to remind you of a few things. First, this conversation is being recorded and will be available to watch on our YouTube page in the coming days. And second, we would love to take your questions, and we will do so later in the conversation. Please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions throughout the event. And lastly, and most importantly, I would like to thank the generous donors and members of the International Churchill Society for your support. We are a nonprofit organization that relies solely on the private support of our members and donors. So thank you to all of you on this call that who are members and donors. And if you'd like to support us, I encourage you to visit winstonchurchill.org/join. Our topic today is the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. And our guest today is author Iain MacGregor, who argues that this battle was the turning point in the Second World War. And it could be argued that Winston Churchill would agree with Iain's assertion. In 1944, Churchill said of the Soviet army, quote, "I have left the obvious, essential fact to this point, namely that it is the Russian armies who have done the main work in tearing the guts out of the German army. There was no force in the world which could have been called into being that would have been able to maul and break the German army unless it had been subjected to the terrible slaughter and manhandling that has fallen to it through the strength of the Russian Soviet armies." Iain has written a new book titled The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, which brings fresh and original research to this topic. Iain has been an editor and publisher for over 25 years. He is the author of the acclaimed oral history of Cold War Berlin, Checkpoint Charlie, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Spectator, and BBC History. The Lighthouse of Stalingrad will be released in America on November 29th, and we will include a link in the chat from which you can pre-order his book today. Iain will now take us through a PowerPoint of his research and book, and we will take questions from the audience later. Iain, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Very much appreciate the invitation.
Of course. So allow me to share my screen, and Iain, we'll have you take it away.
Thank you, Justin. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming online to listen to my talk. I've been giving this talk since July and the UK publication. The Lighthouse of Stalingrad is primarily about one of the big legends from arguably well, it is the biggest battle of the Second World War, but it's arguably the biggest, greatest, bloodiest battle of modern times. Over 3 million combatants, well over 1 million people killed. And obviously it was the turning point, I suppose, psychologically as well as strategically on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. The Lighthouse, as we'll see from later slides that you'll see, is a pivotal building within the heart of the city of the fighting that was codenamed the Lighthouse. Today, and school kids for generations, for decades, all through the Cold War as well, since the end of the Second World War, they've known it as Pavlov's house. Some of you may know that name. That is named, the house itself is named after this sergeant, Jacob Pavlov, who led, as the story goes, this heroic defense against all the odds of keeping the house. It's a mixture of the Alamo and the Magnificent Seven, if I was going to turn that into American analogy. But in all seriousness, to Russians today, and they're taught this story, and there was hundreds of school kids at the building when I was there, which you'll see photos of shortly. To Russians today, they're taught this as if this is Russia's Alamo, or it's a French Verdun, or to the British, it might be our Dunkirk. It means that much to them. It's a pivotal point of the battle, and the battle itself is the cornerstone of what Putin today would see as the greatest victory of the Second World War. And indeed, I mean, I finished writing this book about 3 months before the situation in Ukraine began in February of this year. But the way I've written the introduction and the way I've tried to angle the book as well, because of the research that I found, is just weirdly relevant to what's been going on, what we've seen been going on in the Ukraine. So the photo you see there next to the cover of the book, that's me in the northern sector of the city. It's a huge city. It was back then, and it's even bigger today. It's an urban sprawl. It's like a 25-mile, 40-kilometer ribbon that runs along the length of the River Volga, which again, to Russians, analogy with America would be the Mississippi, I suppose. It's an arterial transportation hub. And that's why it was so important to both the Russians and the Germans at this critical point. So like I said, that photo is of me in one of the ruins that they keep in the city. And it was a city of about 400,000 civilians. It had doubled to about 800,000 by the time the Germans arrived on the 23rd of August. A lot of them were being evacuated, but tens of thousands were still trapped there. And that's when the Germans struck with their aerial assault. And so what they do today, which you'll see in the next slides coming up, is they keep certain sections of the city in situ as they were at the end of the battle. And like I said, that's one of them. And that photo was taken on about 2 years ago to this very day, and it was about -18 in that photo. It doesn't really show it in the photo, but I was shivering cold. But anyway, if we could go to the next slide, please, Justin. So Stalingrad, like I said, biggest battle of the Second World War. And by the end of the battle, as we were mentioning with Churchill, if you have such huge success, a turning point, a pivotal turning point in European continental battle, but in the Second World War as a whole, I suppose, by the end of the war, everybody wanted a piece of the glory or to be associated with it. So right across Europe, lots of cities and towns were naming their, if we could go back, thank you, were naming themselves after the city where the biggest battle of the war had been fought. So these two photos are just from France. And by 1948, there was a lot of socialist local governments in power throughout France. So as a result, there's at least 150 boulevards, avenues, squares named after Stalingrad right across the country. And the photo on the right is one of the main stations on the Paris Metro. Still has the name of Stalingrad. Obviously, the city's been changed. It was changed by Khrushchev in the 1960s to Volgograd, but it's Stalingrad. Everyone knows the city is Stalingrad, and I think there was a vote before the Ukraine situation about whether the city could have its name changed again. But France is just one of a dozen European countries that decided that there would be various changing of names for famous boulevards, streets, buildings, even to the name of Stalingrad. And famously, as we just very quickly mentioned at the start, Churchill, together with King George V, would offer the sword of Stalingrad at the Yalta Conference to Stalin in commemoration of what the people of the city had suffered. And it's a huge thing. And one of the things I found out in my research, which I didn't know about, but I find amazing, is the very first twinning of any modern city in the 20th century. The whole process of twinning a city began in 1942 in November, when housewives from the blitzed English city of Coventry, which had been destroyed by the German Luftwaffe. It was probably our biggest destructive area in the Blitz. The women of that city petitioned the British government to say, we would like to be twinned with Stalingrad because we've gone through what they're going through.
Wow.
And that relationship lasted all the way through till March of this year, when the local government took a vote, local council, I should say, took a vote, and they decided to rescind the cultural relationship that had survived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the Cold War, the invasion of Afghanistan in the 70s. And yet they've decided now to break the relationship. And I wrote a piece that you'll find in the Spectator magazine online saying I disagreed with it, because I think the very last link you should be breaking is cultural. By all means, do economic sanctions and everything else, because we have to make a stand on this, but you have to have some kind of backdoor leverage, and usually it's through cultural relationships. And if you burn that bridge, then there's no going back, I think. And so you can find that article and see if you agree with it or not. But if we go to the next slide, please, Justin. So I went to the city during lockdown. I was very lucky. I made a friend of the director of the museum. You'll see a photo of the museum shortly. and he's about my age, and he's the new generation of academics that have come through, that have taken over from the old guard that served throughout the Cold War. And so he was very keen. He'd said to me on email, because we were corresponding for weeks beforehand, no Western historian comes to Volgograd. They all go to Moscow. They want to go to Podolsk, the military archive outside of Moscow, because that's where Anthony Beevor went, and that's the archive he's made famous. But no Western historian's been allowed access to Podolsk for at least the last year, if not 2 years. And so I thought, if I want to talk about a specific fight within the massive battle of the Battle of Stalingrad, I need to really go to the womb, so to speak, and I need to go to the city itself. So that's why I wanted to go to Volgograd. So I was very, very fortunate to be invited, and I traveled in lockdown. So what I'm showing you here is the immensity of the losses and the destruction. So the Soviet army lost minimum 1.1 million men dead, and nearly 1.9 million casualties altogether. The German and Axis forces lost nearly 500,000 men dead. So this is a colossal amount of human suffering, not including what happened to the civilians. Of this city that was 40 kilometers long, 95% of it was reduced to rubble. And that's the famous scenes we see where, if you've watched those films, Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law, for instance, you're fighting, it's the first big modern day fight of urban warfare, fighting for a ruined city, and ambushes here, there, and everywhere. So when you're just a local walking around the city, you can't help but see these commemorations that reflect the huge sacrifices and the huge suffering of both sides, one could argue. And so just walking down an everyday street, on the picture on the right-hand side of that trio, that's about 20 foot high. It's massive. And that is similar to most statues you'll see, very much in the Russian modernist style. It's made of metal. And what that represents is that's a young communist. They would belong to what was called the Komsomol, and they were all under 18 years of age. And you'll see it in a map I'm going to show you, but because the Soviets and Stalin himself, they were strategically caught on the wrong foot by Hitler's summer offensive in 1942. They thought they were going to be attacking again towards Moscow, the capital, but instead Hitler plunges south and goes for the Russian oil in the Caucasus. And obviously Stalingrad's part of this master plan. So Stalin is moving troops to try and match this threat, but they're weeks behind the Germans. And so by the time the German 6th Army is outside the gates of Stalingrad, August 23rd, there isn't much defenses prepared to try and beat him off. They constructed defenses, but there's not many soldiers there because they're elsewhere, or they're falling back rapidly. So what was left was militia, NKVD security police, who actually performed heroically. There's 10,000 of them at the start of the battle. And these guys, these Komsomol young communists. So what this statue represents is about 20,000 who were killed or wounded in the first week of the battle. First week, 20,000. And they were the ones that stopped the juggernaut of the main bulk of the German 6th Army advancing on the city to capture it. Because ultimately, the Germans thought they would capture this city just like they captured many other cities in the European zone of Soviet territory, obviously the Ukraine. So they captured Kyiv, Smolensk, Odessa, Sevastopol. They thought Stalingrad would be the same, and they'd probably take it within 2 to 3 weeks. But it was this kind of human sacrifice which broke this wave and managed to buy time to get the Russian defenses up and running. And then on the left-hand side is a very, very famous statue, and that's outside what is now, you might know as the grain elevator, and that's in the southern part of the city. And what you've got there is a guy, again, this statue is about 30 foot high, dominates the area, and that's a typical Red Army soldier carrying the famous anti-tank rifle that they used in the city against German armor. And this was the first taste of what the Germans were going to have to do to take the city. So the fight for the grain elevator took a whole German division, and they wasted probably about 2 whole battalions of troops to take this grain elevator. It was about 5 days of fierce, incessant fighting to take it room by room, floor by floor. And by the end of the battle, they realized they'd only been up against a company of Soviet soldiers, and most of whom fought to their death. I think there was probably 2 to 3 survivors. but all of them fought to the end. And that's just to take one building in the city. And that would be the pattern of behavior as we go through the next 5 months of fighting. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is in the northern part of the city, and these are my photos as well. And so, like I was saying, they keep mementos, or I should say, historically valuable buildings intact. And this is by the factory district. So as you'll see, I'll show you in a little while, the city itself was in 3 pieces, really. The south of the city was the old part of the city, which had been called Tsaritsyn in the Tsar's times, all the way through the 19th century and then into the 20th century. And that was just muddied cobbled streets, wooden shacks 2 stories high, and you got a lot of agricultural workers worked there. And that's why you had the grain elevator there as well that you saw in the previous slide. Then you had the modern Soviet showpiece city, which you'll see a photo of in a sec. And in the northern sector was the factory district. And so this photo here on the left of the house, these are the workers' settlements by the factory district. And by this time, so 80 years ago this month, and in the month previous, the fierce fighting for the northern part of the city around this settlement had been going on. And like I said, people, when I took this photo, people were still living in this house. And as you can see from the outside, it's suffered a lot of shrapnel and bullet damage. And then when you go into the stairwells, and I bumped into a couple of housewives that were coming out to go and do shopping. The stairwell has got grenade, shrapnel, and bullet damage too. And I could have went in a dozen houses along this street, and I would have found very, very similar damage. But don't get me wrong, it's a modern city. It reminds me a lot of Chicago, actually, in the fact that it's quite a sprawl based on a river or a giant lake, as Chicago is. But and it's very industrial. But it's amazing that people would still want to live in this kind of accommodation, but they're proud of it because they know this is our victory. So if we go to the next slide again. So the photo on the left, this is the Stalingrad in the center of the city was split, and it had this enormous hill that's famously called the Mamayev Kurgan. And that's where I would argue, just judging by the number of casualties and the number of shells that fell on it over 5 months of battle, is probably the most contested piece of ground in any theatre of the Second World War. Tens of thousands of men died on that hill. Millions of shells were expended on that hill. And so what the Soviets did was, in the 60s, they built this enormous complex. It's the Mamayev Kurgan complex, and it goes up in steps, opens up into big squares and tree-lined boulevards. And when you get to the top, because it's over 300 foot high, and that's the reason why it was so crucial to both sides. It was the high ground in the battle. You're on the top of there, you can see 5 miles in any direction. And the Germans needed it because then they could interdict any Soviet reinforcements that were coming across the Volga River. And obviously the Soviets needed it because then they could see where the Germans were massing on the outskirts of the city and which part of the cities they were going to attack. And that's why both sides wanted it. But it's an incredible complex. The statue you can see in the background there, that's called the Motherland Calls. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty. And she's pointing towards the west. She's basically pointing towards Berlin because that's where they were going to go. She's holding the Sword of Courage. And it's an incredibly, it's been designed very well. The concept's amazing, but it evokes all the emotions, especially if you're a Soviet citizen and you're going to pay tribute to a family member there. It captures every single moment of the battle in quite brutal artworks and statues and moldings and things like that. And it's got its eternal flame, which you can Google, you'll find. But what I found amazing was you go past the statue and then you're on the basic scrubland of the hill. And I'd been told by several historians before I went out, oh, you'll find some ordnance there. You will find some World War II ordnance. And I was thinking, well, that's nonsense. It's almost 80 years ago now. They must have dug it all up. And I just happened to be walking along a bit of the park, and I stood on something, and it was a tiny, tiny piece of metal that was sticking out the ground. I mean, literally no bigger than your fingernail. And I thought, well, it's a piece of shrapnel. I'll try and pick that up. And it took me half an hour. And in the end, I was on my knees digging it out with my hands. and I've got an 80mm heavy mortar Soviet tail fin there. And that's just me stepping on something that I wasn't expecting to find. And I would have loved to have brought it back through customs, but that wasn't going to happen. So that's presently in the armory of the Volgograd Museum. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the lighthouse, this is the lighthouse. On the left-hand side, that's what it looked like at the end of the battle. As you can see, it's seen much better days. And on the right-hand side is the photograph I took of how it looks today. So as you can see, they've kept just a tiny piece of it. There's almost like a frieze on the end of the rebuilt building. And the building itself is, I took it, I was trying to be arty and took it in black and white, but it's a lovely yellow, lemon yellow color. And it's right by the banks of the Volga. And you'll see in a map in a moment, the reason why this house was so central was much like the Mamayev Kurgan that you just saw. There wasn't many buildings left standing by the time of the German bombardments. And this was standing because it was a new building. It had only been built in the early 30s. It was part of this showpiece central part of the city that Stalin had ordered to be built. And this building would have housed the elite of the local party, as well as technicians and engineers who were working in the factory district to the north. So this had what many Soviet peasants didn't have in the city: hot and cold running water, gas mains supplied, electricity, but crucially, which is why it's still standing, reinforced concrete bunkers and reinforced girders throughout the building. So despite incessant bombing at the start of the battle, and then once the defense of the house started, it just wasn't going to fall down. And so that's why the heart of the city, if you've seen, like I said, the Hollywood films, the heart of the city is where the fighting was, because those buildings were still left standing. The southern half of the city was pretty much razed to the ground because it was wooden shacks. And then the north of the city, where the factory districts were, again, they were pretty much smashed to pieces. It's only in the center of the city where you've got some apartment blocks and the famous department store where the Germans surrendered at the end. They were standing because they had these reinforced concrete. But that's what made them deadly too. They had reinforced bunkers, which both sides, if they captured them, would turn them into impregnable mini fortresses. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is the museum I was telling you about. It was constructed once Stalin had died and Nikita Khrushchev was in charge. For a couple of years, either side of, well, from about 1959 to about 1961, there was a thaw, there's a bit of liberalization in the Soviet Union. So this museum had been started to be built by about 1956. And what they did was, as many museums that were doing at the time that were being built too under Khrushchev, was they had a national campaign of advertising in newspapers, maybe on radio too, of saying, did you fight in Stalingrad? And obviously millions had. If so, write to the museum administrators, and we will supply you with the necessary means to send us in your recollections. And so what you've got in, in the archives, which are to the right of the photograph, which is where I went, that's the main entrance going into the exhibits, is literally tens of thousands of little green school books and letters that they might send and other things as well, personal memorabilia. And they're in files. And the museum's been collecting that since about, like I said, 1958, 59. And then they probably stopped by about, I think, the mid 70s, when a lot of veterans were dying off, and they just stopped. But it's an incredible collection of testimonies. And that's why, to me anyway, that's why it was important to go there, because I thought no Western historian has been to this archive. If I'm going to find out what happened to a specific unit that I want to talk about that fought for the heart of the city and was defending this lighthouse, Pavlov's house, I might be able to find out what was going on. That's what I hope to do, and that's what happened. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is the kind of thing I was happening. It was probably about 2 years ago to this very day. So I went over in mid to late November, and the Russian winter's in full effect. It was about -18 by the river at night time, which is great if you're a writer, because you can go and experience it. It gives you an idea of how you should write and describe the scenes when you're telling non-fiction. Anyway, but I spent a week in the archives, and I could have spent a month easily in these archives. but that was the time I was allowed on the special professional visa they give it me, because I shouldn't have really have been there. And I probably had about 900 of these files that you can see on your left-hand side. But what had happened over the weeks before I'd gone, I'd said to them, well, this is the division, the Soviet division I want to talk about. It's the 13th Guards Rifle Division that defended the center of the city at the beginning and is very famous in Russia and the Soviet Union. It's the one that's was at the start of the battle and is said to have saved the city from complete capture very quickly. And so I'd given the names of the people I wanted to in terms of commanding officers, going all the way down the various ranks and the specific units within the division. So when I arrived at the museum in the archive, they had a whole pile of these files waiting for me. So I literally spent a week with a translator going through, I think I got through 400 out of the 900 by the end. And I came away with probably about 180,000 words of translated text from various testimonies. And so the guy you can see on your right there, that's Major General Alexander Radimtsev, and he's the commander of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, and he is a hero. He's like, I would imagine, Patton, General George Patton. He's probably the equivalent. He was a similar character, never say die, died with his boots on, that kind of thing. And he's the real deal. And so to see his personal file, and when I opened it, it was wrapped in tracing paper that you can tell has never been opened. It was in smooth, pristine condition. And it, again, for a historian, the hairs on the back of your neck go and think, I hope, fingers crossed, I find something special here. And it was amazing. And his was just one, like I said, one of 400 that I looked at. So if we go to the next slide, please.
I was going to say, can you read Russian? But I'm glad you said that you had a translator.
Oh, no, I mean, I would add that it's the same with German. I can speak and read German to a degree, but if you're trying to tell a 100% accurate story from an historical perspective, it has to be 100% accurate. So I was quite happy to spend, I won't tell you the exact bill, but it was a lot of money on professional translators to help me with this. So again, I could show you a lot of photographs from the archive because I just wasn't sitting by a table reading testimonies. They were so good. They gave me free reign in the archive, and there's an armory there, and then there's a clothing archive. Everything that is captured from the enemy in terms of materiel, maps, pipes, cigarette cases, clothing is there. And I just chose this because I thought it's very it's quite emotive because they are actually German winter boots that they made, and that's a Soviet Red Army soldier trying them on as a joke at the end of the battle, and that's why his comrades are around in a circle and they're all looking at them and going, well, these aren't as good as our felt boots, which they weren't. They didn't insulate you enough, and obviously they look like a deep sea diver would wear those. But they're in immaculate condition, and it was just an amazing thing to be able to go through and pick up and analyze and examine these things that had been lying on the battlefield and just by some happen chance ended up in the archives of this museum. So next slide, please. So I'll very quickly, the next 3 or 4 slides, this is how Stalingrad happened. So 22nd of June, 1941, on the left-hand side, you've got Hitler starts Operation Barbarossa, his big gamble that he hoped would be a repeat of what he'd done to France the previous summer, knock out Russia, knock out the Red Army in one summer's campaigning. And for that, it's the biggest military invasion in history, over 3 million troops, 3 huge tank armies as well, motorized. I mean, a lot of the German forces were on foot and horse-drawn, but they still had over 3,000 tanks. Like I said, 3 army groups, north, center, and south, and they hoped that would cover this 1,500-kilometer frontier. The whole principle was to knock out the Red Army in the field. They thought they'd done that, and you would think, I don't blame them for thinking they had done that, because in those summer months of fighting, as Barbarossa kicked off, within 3 months, they captured 3 million Red Army troops, and they killed nearly 3 million Red Army troops. So the Red Army had lost over 6 million troops. And for any country, that would be crippling. But they managed to cling on. And then obviously, as the photo on the right-hand side shows, the Red Army, Stalin, was saved outside the gates of Moscow by tenacious defending, it has to be said, and also the Soviet winter, the Russian winter hit, as it had Napoleon all those years ago. And that stopped the German army in its tracks because they just hadn't thought that they'd still be fighting by December outside the gates of Moscow. And all along, I mean, they were down in the south. They were almost at the gates of the Caucasus as well. So the Red Army struck, hit them with a huge counterattack, because by then, by December, spies in Tokyo had told Stalin that Japan, Imperial Japan, wasn't focusing on the Soviet Eastern Front. They were going to attack the American forces and Allied forces in the Pacific. So he was able to move 50 divisions protecting that flank over to the west, and they were the ones that he sent straight in to the exhausted, it has to be said, German forces. They'd lost over 1 million men to combat and frostbite. And it almost worked. So if we can go to the next slide, because I think this slide's important. What we learned from that Russian counteroffensive, which almost could have destroyed the German army on the Eastern Front, but Hitler's tenacity and his, I suppose, racial superiority of we cannot be beaten by the Slav race, we are the superior Aryan race, forced him to impose upon his commanders this stand and fight doctrine, as in we will set up kessels, cauldrons, fortified points, and we're going to hold off their advance, and then they will be resupplied. And in that first Russian winter campaign of the counteroffensive, that worked, and it did save the army. And he came out of that, even though Barbarossa hadn't worked, he'd lost over 1 million men. He now couldn't repeat that the following summer, an attack on such a huge front, because he didn't have the resources, but he still had his reputation intact because his commanders thought he's got the golden touch. He saved the army at the point of defeat in the wintertime. He's still good to go. And so what you've got here is, this is the spring of 1942. And ironically, the gentleman's looking intently over the maps by Hitler with the Iron Cross around his neck. That's General Friedrich Paulus, who would be Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. And so this plan was that, again, Hitler was a gambler. He was going to roll the dice one more time, and instead of, obviously, he couldn't attack across a wide front. He was going to tie the Red Army down in the center and fool Stalin that Moscow was again the target. He was going to tie down the north and besiege Leningrad, as they were doing. And he was going to strip some of those armies from north and center, reinforce Army Group South, and plunge down into southern Russia, because by now he declared war on America. It was now a global economic war. He needed to make this work. He needed the means to keep his war machine going, oil and mineral wealth. So if we go to the next slide, please, I'll crack on, because I know we don't want to waste too much more time. So I'm hoping that I've done a brilliant interactive map. I'm going to sell it to you, and I'm hoping it works. And if Justin clicks it, it should work. So this is Operation Case Blau. Yes, it works, Justin.
Wow, look at this.
And so it was going to be in 4 phases. And typically phase 1 was the blitzkrieg incisive maneuver straight through the Soviet defense, capture key transportation hubs that they would be able to maximize. They were going to push south, but at the time, Stalingrad was only to protect a flank. It wasn't to actually capture the city, because they needed to get to the Volga to stop resupply along the Volga. Then they were going to capture Rostov, which was a city that was seen as the gateway into the Caucasus, which they did. They captured that within 3 weeks. And then the bulk of the army would march down into the southern Caucasus to capture the oil. Now, the point to this was, and why we're tracking back to Stalingrad, is throughout that summer, it was working to a degree, but by this time, the Soviet forces had learned their lesson. They weren't standing and fighting as they had the year before, being surrounded, captured, and obliterated. They were falling back in line and in order to save themselves to further battles. But this lulled Hitler into a false sense of security. He was thinking, there is no Red Army out there. They haven't disappeared to fight another day. We just, my hopes and dreams have actually come to fruition. We destroyed the bulk of the Red Army the year before. Therefore, I'm going to split my forces up. And he wanted his cake and eating it. So half the army, Army Group B, was going to march towards Stalingrad and take the city and take the Volga and cut off supplies coming from the south. You can see Astrakhan in the south there. A lot of American lend-lease were coming up that way. and the other half of the army would go down to the Caucasus. But it's too big logistically. You're talking over 2,000 kilometers of territory, too few troops, too few motorized formations. It couldn't work. The Russians were putting up a big fight. Soviets were putting up a big fight, I should say, in the south. And so all eyes were tracking back to Stalingrad. He knew he wasn't going to take the Caucasus that year. He had to have something tangible that would reflect the men and machinery he'd again wasted in a foolhardy offensive. So we go to the next slide, please.
Oh, hang on. Let me see if I can.
If you give it a double click, it might. There you go. So very quickly, this is the center of Stalingrad, like I was saying. So this was built in the 1930s. And on your right-hand side is just a still from one of the 3 massive factories that they built in the north of the city. And this was built, all this was built mainly on American loans and American know-how and engineering know-how. There was a lot of American companies came over, and French and British, don't get me wrong, that worked on building up Stalingrad into a modern city, because this was going to be the first of over a dozen Soviet cities that Stalin was going to build in the 1930s. Obviously, he didn't know the war was coming. They chose Stalingrad because it's a transportation hub, as you've seen from the map before. It had the Volga. So if they got it right, they would be able to farm the vast fields of corn in the Ukrainian steppe, ironically. And so the city itself would become almost like a second Moscow. On the left there, it's got modern boulevards, shops, parks, cinemas, department stores that were selling everything in the capital city. And then the workforce was working in these giant factories in the north, primarily building factory tools and vehicles for this great expansion of their agricultural plan. But when the war started, as many countries did, they turned over this kind of manufacturing into tooling up for armaments. So by the time the Germans arrived outside Stalingrad, August 23rd, the factory district was basically churning out T-34 tanks, armored boats, and planes. Next slide, please. So this is them. This is, remember the photo you see on the left? That's the 6th Army, as you would have seen in Nazi newspapers in Germany, proclaiming this great new offensive in the summer. And this is the 6th Army marching its way slowly towards the east and obviously future oblivion. And by the time they got outside the city, the commander you saw looking over the map with Hitler, that's him now looking through his binoculars, looking at the city. And Pavlov was actually concerned because he'd spent 7 weeks fighting his way through to Stalingrad with Army Group B. They'd taken a lot of casualties, even though he had over 25 divisions. A lot of them, the majority of them, were very under strength because of the casualty rates. He'd lost a lot of armor. The only thing he had going for him really was he had a lot of strength in the Luftwaffe still. So the bulk of the strength he had to attack the city at the beginning was incessant Luftwaffe attacks, which he thought would terrorize and bomb the city into submission, but it didn't work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And this is the famous photos that you will see. The black smoke is this is from the factory district in the north with the petroleum tanks going up in flames. Now the Luftwaffe unmercilessly bombed, as they had done Rotterdam and several other cities and British cities in the Blitz. They mercilessly bombed this city to rubble. Like I said, 95% of it would be destroyed, by the end of the battle. But what I found strange was I'd always looked at other books and heard the legends that this is up until the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima in August 1945. Apparently, the first day's bombing on Stalingrad was the most deadly attack on civilians in the Second World War. Wow. Over 40,000 were said to have been killed. And this is Soviet news reports that were then disseminated to the Western press. But when I went to the archives, I also went to the municipal archives and I looked at the casualty sheets of all the various districts throughout the city to see, how many did actually die. And I totaled up the numbers, and all I could find was, I don't say this flippantly, people still died, but it was just over 1,800 casualties dead. Now, wow. Between 1,800 and 40,000, I'm sure the truth is there somewhere, but the story will, the accurate story will never be told, because as we'll see from the Lighthouse we're going to talk about now, this is where Soviet propaganda takes over to boost morale of what there was a losing fight at one point, to try and gird the loins of the defenders and the citizens of the country too. So go to the next slide, please. So I've told you about the Russians. I'll quickly tell you about what was really interesting for me was I couldn't go to Germany because they were in very strict lockdown. All the museums were shut, even if I'd gone there. So what I did was my story, because it's about the Lighthouse, is about the German division that was opposite the Lighthouse, which was the 71st Infantry Division. And as I've told you about, the 13th Guards Rifle Division. So that's what my book's about, this intimate fight on a human level between just two divisions, which is a metaphor for the whole battle. So I put about 5 or 6 adverts out in regional press of where this division came from, which was Saxony in southern Germany. And I got about 30 replies over about a 6-month period. And
That's
about
a brilliant
5 of them, yeah, I mean, about 5 of them I've used in the book. But the big character, and historically very important character, is this gentleman here. And the photo you see there is he's Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Fritz Rosker. And he would survive the battle. He joined the 71st Infantry Division and commanded a regiment. And he'd been injured the year before. He'd been teaching tactics up until the 6th Army was at Stalingrad. And then because of all the losses they were having, especially in frontline commanders, he volunteered to go there. So he was dropped in and he led one of the frontline regiments of the 71st Infantry Division. He survived the fighting. He survived captivity for 12 years after the surrender. Served in various gulags around the Gulag archipelago, came back to West Germany. Dusseldorf is where he's from. Came back to Dusseldorf, summer of 55. Put together the photo you see on the right. Then wrote his memoir of the battle in longhand, and he was a trained architect. He even worked in Manhattan in the 1920s for an architectural practice. He put all these papers together. Which is an incredible story. No one's ever seen it before. He put it in a briefcase and then he hung himself on Christmas Day, 1956. Oh, and his family looked after this briefcase for decades. And it was only his youngest son, he had 5 children, his youngest son, who's 82 today, he's a retired doctor. He saw my advert and we started communicating. He was sending me scans of these letters. And in the end, in an incredible gesture, he said, look, I trust you. I know you're going to tell the right story or the true story. I'll courier everything over to you. And so, again, I was incredibly grateful to get this. And incredible. His memoir tells a completely different story to the end of the battle, which is what we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So if you go to the next slide, please. So these are photographs of his unit. He led the first attack into the city, which was hugely successful. So instead of attacking along a broad front, he decided to attack it's very German-like. Combat commander on the front line takes the initiative and decides this is what they're going to do, and that's what he was allowed to do. They attacked in heavy mass with armored support and aircraft support in on 2 points in the Soviet line defending the center of the city, and it worked. So these are photographs of his troops blitzing their way into the city on the 13th of September. And they got to the Volga on the same day. And that caused, and I spent a whole chapter of the book talking about this, never been talked about before. And I mean, he lost a lot of men. He lost more men in friendly fire. There was a blue on blue with Stuka's dive bombing and destroying one of his whole company gets wiped out. But he got to the river and that caused jubilation at Hitler's headquarters in Poltava in Ukraine, where he was based that summer. But consternation at Stavka and in Stalin's offices in Moscow, as in how the hell have they got to the Volga in their first attempt in 24 hours? And so what Stalin demanded from the commanders was there has to be an instant reaction. We cannot let my city fall in 24 hours. So if we go to the next slide.
And Iain, maybe another 5-6 minutes and we'll get to.
Yep. I'll chew through these. Yep. These 2 commanders are the main heroes for my story. On the left-hand side is the commander of the 62nd Army who defended the city. That's Vasily Chukov, hugely hard general, fought to the bitter end, would die with his boots on. That's Redimtsev on the right-hand side as he looked at the Battle of Stalingrad. So you saw his photo on that ID card. That's how he looked. He was given the order.
That's the guy from the ID card?
Yeah. That's how he looked at the beginning of the war. Wow. So he was given the order. His division had just arrived on the other side of the Volga. And this is the division that you will see that Jude Law is with in Enemy at the Gates that go across the river. That film is full of holes. They were all armed to the teeth. They weren't given 1 rifle per 3 men and you pick it up as the guy gets shot. and they weren't shot by security police if they were turning back. They wanted to go across. They, as I capture in the book, through all the testimonies. So if we go to the next slide, and we'll go through the map very quickly. So as you can see in black and grey, that's the area of the city that Rosker's troops were holding. The red line is very much Saving Private Ryan. Radimtsev led his troops across in a night assault. 10,000 men he took in, and they recaptured parts of the city. Germans counterattacked, as they always did, and the blue house you can just detect in the center there. That is Pavlov's house, and that's why it was so crucial to both sides. It was the highest point in the center of the city. If you had that part of the house, you would then govern the reconnaissance of everywhere else. Next slide, please. I'll crack on. This is a typical propaganda shot of what kind of is famous for this urban combat in Stalingrad, the Soviet combat group. And this is an innovation that Churchill brought to the battle. Instead of attacking on a broad front as he had done at the beginning of the battle, he was now going to split his forces into these 6-man teams who were armed to the teeth with grenades, which they called their pocket artillery, and submachine guns, because it's all about fire superiority and trying to win. And this is where you get this famous capturing and fighting in buildings, room by room, floor by floor, fighting in the sewers. And it was constant 24/7. And that's why you end up having this meat grinder of a battle. And typically the life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad during the height of the battle was about 24 hours.
That's incredible.
So go to the next slide. This is Pavlov. So this is Sergeant Pavlov, who you would have seen in the Russian press during the height of the battle when this story was told. So that very quickly, the story is he was in a combat group that was tasked to take Pavlov's house, or take the house in no man's land, which he did with a 6-man team. He was then reinforced with 28 men from his platoon. And as the legend goes, these 28 men came from the 28 different republics of the Soviet Union, so everyone's represented. And then they held it off in a very Magnificent Seven type way from thousands of German troops that then tried to retake this house, a whole German division, which is the 71st Infantry Division. And that's the story that Russian troops and then civilians and then people in post-war Soviet Union got to learn about, which if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you why. The gentleman on your left is Lieutenant Julius Shapurin. He was a playwright in before the war, which bodes well for what he was going to do in the Second World War. And like Vasily Grossman, very similar, he was a war correspondent, and he was one of about 400 war correspondents that were operating in Stalingrad along the front at the time. It wasn't just in the city, it's 100 kilometers to the north and south. And so he came upon Pavlov's house when it was in a quiet part of the zone and the fighting had moved to the factory district. So there wasn't a lot of fighting going on, so it was safe for him to be there. He was the one that interviewed the troops, but the house itself wasn't guarded by 28 men. It was guarded by 200 to 300 men constantly, and there was a rotation of troops going in. They turned it into a mini fortress. It had barbed wire fields, minefields, heavy machine guns, and in some places small artillery as well. But because 95% of the city was destroyed and the bulk of the city was now under domination of the Germans, they needed feel-good stories for the troops that were fighting. And that he was just one of dozens of correspondents that were trying to find these stories. So this was the story that he constructed that people started to read. And the very first mention of Pavlov's house is in this paper on your right-hand side, and that's called Stalin's Banner. And that was the local paper of the 62nd Army defending the city. And within 2 weeks of that story breaking, it was all over the country, and it was being broadcast on national radio by Stalin's favorite broadcaster. And so everybody knew by Christmas, and definitely by the end of the battle in January, everybody knew about Pavlov's house. Next slide, please. We'll be very quick. End of the battle. This is the Russian counteroffensive has happened. They surrounded the city. The Germans, over 320,000 troops, were slowly driven back from their perimeter outside the city in this encirclement to when they were just surviving in the ruins of the city they'd been trying to take. So by the 31st of January, as you can see on the left-hand side, Field Marshal Paulus, as he is now, this is a photo of him coming in to surrender to the Soviet High Command. That's Rosker on the right-hand side. He's now a major general because his commanding officer had died. But as his memoirs tells, and no one knew this before, and then what I capture in the book is he actually conducted the surrender proceedings. There's been
Mm.
different stories told because that's all the material we had. But until we had his actual memoir, we now know that it was his perimeter Paulus was being shielded in. He was the commander of that perimeter. So it was down to him to
Wow.
organize and negotiate the surrender. And that's what I capture in the book. So next slide, please. We'll be very quick. This is the Sixth Army. So 320,000 men were encircled. 91,000 survived to then march off into captivity, 31st of January. Of that 91,000, about 50,000 had died within about 3 to 4 weeks, because as you can see, they'd been surrounded for 2 months in bitter winter conditions. Their supplies were low. They were suffering dysentery, typhus, all kinds of diseases. So obviously, the Soviets just didn't realize they were capturing this many prisoners, and they could barely feed their own troops, let alone this number of captured personnel. And so that's why there was a drop off. They didn't have the motor vehicles to take them off as they would have done normally to prisoner of war camps. They had to march them off into the bitter cold, and that's why there was such a huge drop off. And so, like I said earlier, by the time of 1955 and the final POWs come back from Russia, there's 5,000 made it home.
That's incredible.
Next slide, please. So this is a really interesting part, which no one's really talked about. The city's getting rebuilt. Be very quick, Justin. The city's getting rebuilt. They're running out. They haven't got the wherewithal or the passion to rebuild a completely destroyed city. They were using some POWs as well. So next slide. But what happened was, by that summer of 1943, the lady on your left, this is Alexandra Cherkasova. She was a local communist. She wrote to the local city newspaper, and she was volunteering her services free. And her block, her apartment block, she said, we will rebuild houses around our area for free because we're dedicated communists. This is a great battle. We are going to rebuild our city very quickly. And the first house we're going to rebuild is Pavlov's house, because we've read and heard so much about it. And that's exactly what they did. And it was a huge media event. And to cut a long story short, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of man-hours were given over free by local communists, and then obviously citizens that felt compelled to join in, and they were rebuilding the city. But then this movement was transplanted to other cities that had been destroyed by the invading armies. And ironically, a lot of them were in Ukraine. Smolensk, Kyiv, Sevastopol, Odessa, they were all rebuilt. And this Cherkasova movement took on a momentum all of its own. But one of the cruxes of the movement was Pavlov's house, and that's why it became too big to fail. Next slide, please. I've only got a couple more. This is Pavlov himself on the left-hand side. And as you can see, this is in the 1960s. You can see he's got every medal there is to be awarded. His rise to fame was meteoric. He was given the highest military honors you can get, the Order of Lenin, etc. He was elected to the highest political offices in the land, the Supreme Soviet. Him and his family were moved out of, because they'd grown up in a farmstead 60 or 70 miles outside of Moscow. That's where he's from. They were moved into elite accommodation in Moscow, and both his children went to elite universities. Pavlov himself, you know, he's a poster boy. He toured the USSR throughout the Cold War, giving talks, telling about his deeds. He even traveled to Cuba to shake Fidel Castro's hand. Don't get me wrong, he's a brave man. He was wounded seriously 3 times in action, but he obviously is the poster boy. The picture you got on your right is his comrades from the 13th Guards Rifle Division, who once a year would meet in a very Band of Brothers style at the embankment that they'd retaken famously in the battle. And testimonies that I've read had told me that it got to the point where Pavlov wasn't going to the reunions by the 1970s. And you can only surmise why. I would imagine he was probably getting his leg pulled too many times. But here's the thing, the 13th Guards Rifle Division, they're so famous because they took 10,000 men across the river that night to assault the city. They survived 5 months of fighting, and by the end, there was less than 210 standing. And that's a metaphor for the losses of all Soviet divisions that fought in Stalingrad. Next slide. These are the men that I looked at their testimonies to get to the true story. The larger picture on the right is the colonel of the regiment Pavlov served in, the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment. The picture top is his battalion commander, Captain Zhukov. And then the picture on the left, bottom left, is his company commander, Lieutenant Afanasyev, who was actually the commander of the house. Next slide. This is Afanasayev with Redimtsev at a reunion in the 60s on the right-hand side. And basically, Afanasayev's been written out of history, airbrushed out of history, and that's why he's a major part of my story. But very quickly, the man on the left, this is incredible. This is General Ivan Lashkin, and he took the surrender of Field Marshal Paulus on the 31st of January, and he oversaw the taking him back to Soviet lines. And he's Ukrainian. He's from the Crimea. And don't get me wrong, he's a dyed-in-the-wool Soviet. If he was alive today and I'm interviewing, he'd probably say, I'm a communist, I'm a Soviet, I don't see nationalities. But his actual place of birth is the Crimea. He's Ukrainian. And I could tell you a completely new story about him, but I won't go. Last slide. This is Roska when he came home in 55. And as you can see, he's a very changed man. And this is his headstone in a cemetery in Düsseldorf. And again, the irony is, during the last days of the Kessel, and the last radio messages are coming through from German lines, one of the last cables was directed to him, and it was his wife telling him she just had their 5th child, and it was a son, and it would be called Uwe. And Uwe is the man that I've been dealing with to get me his paperwork.
Yeah,
and then one final, yeah, we're done.
All right.
No, it's fine.
And we'll get to some of these questions, and Iain, first off, thank you. Really, yeah. I mean, tying in Roska and bringing that to the fore, and I mean, ending with that last telegram, incredible. So let's have this is from Andrew Luberis. Iain, is it true that Hitler waited till June 22nd instead of the spring to launch Barbarossa because he wanted to prove that he could do what Napoleon had failed to? And I would say, if you could answer these in very quickly, quick succession.
No, it didn't have anything to do with that. It was more to do with the fact that he had to subdue the Balkans. So the bulk of his forces, not the bulk of his forces, but he had to send some armored formations and some elite units to basically defeat the British, the Allied forces that were propping up Greek troops in the Balkans, and then obviously capture things like Crete, because strategically it fitted in with what he was trying to do in North Africa as well. He had to protect his flank. He had to secure the flank before he was then going to march into Russia.
This is from Todd. What is Stalingrad's, now Volgograd's, prominence in Russia today, other than of historical significance?
Well, it's still a major transportation hub. It's still a big industrial center, and it's still an agricultural base. Those things haven't changed. If anything, it's got bigger. As I said before, the city is about 40 kilometers long during the war. It's far, far bigger now. I mean, it's a modern city. And I'd argue, having been to other Soviet cities, and I've been to St. Petersburg and I've been to Moscow, Volgograd's a really big modern city. It's got lovely airports. The local population, well, up until the Ukrainian war, I suppose, but they've got a very good standard of living as well.
For Carol, the object that he was holding when he dug out of the ground, that was a Russian mortar, is that right?
Yeah, Soviet 80 millimeter mortar.
This is from Wesley. What is the 71st German Division's leader's last name, and can you spell it?
Well, the guy who's I've been focusing on in the talk is Roske, R-O-S-K-E, but the actual commander for the majority of the battle is Major General Alexander von Hartmann, who ironically, most of his personal papers are housed at Stanford University.
Amazing how universities can.
Yeah, I tracked them down.
So this is an interesting question. Bivor suggests that Stalin, sometimes listening to his advisors, whereas Hitler rarely did, had strategic and tactical impacts. How do you feel that this factor, meaning listening to the leaders on the ground, ultimately weighs against others such as resources, environment, morale, etc.?
Well, yeah, I mean that the difference is on two different levels. On the political level, Stalin learned his lessons from the first year of fighting and started listening to his generals. He obviously, it was such a disaster. He'd lost so many men and tanks and planes and everything else, his European army basically, that he thought, I can't do this. And he did have a major element of trust in commanders like Zhukov and Timoshenko and people like that. Whereas the exact opposite with Hitler. So it's the paranoid nature of the man as well. I'm not saying Stalin wasn't paranoid, but with Hitler, he saw the failure of Barbarossa in the first year as down to his generals. They just hadn't implemented the plan. So he fired over 40 generals and field marshals before the summer campaign in 1942. But what he'd done was, in some areas, he'd replaced them with yes men, and they're not going to go against you. And he surrounded mainly, again, at that level, he surrounded himself at his headquarters with yes men. So no one's telling him what he doesn't want to hear. And he won't believe the intelligence because it goes against his racial opinion of his opponent too. So that's the thing. And then in the battle itself, very quickly, Churchill, who I showed you a photo of, he was ever more than 50 meters from the enemy positions, maybe 100 meters, I suppose, from enemy front lines. Pavlov at one point was 50 kilometers away. So that, again, that shows you that you've got to have a feeling for what's going on in the battle, and Churchill showed it.
I think your answer just answered a question from Faye Turner, who said, why didn't Paulus withdraw when he had the chance? It's because he wouldn't go against Hitler's orders.
Well, the thing is, though, if again, with the research I did, he wanted to, at every moment after the encirclement, he wanted to break out. He was constantly, I almost said emailing. He was constantly checking in. he's constantly checking with his superiors, not Hitler, because obviously he's in the chain of command, but saying, when are we breaking out? When am I getting the order? We've got our plans in place. Yeah. We know we're going to take casualties, but we want to go. And they just wouldn't give it to him. For whatever reason.
Who was the commander who took over towards the end of the battle, who oversaw the entire area?
Von Manstein.
Yeah, von Manstein, yeah.
And again, he comes out this smelling of roses, and he really shouldn't have. He's the guy that basically doomed the Sixth Army to annihilation.
So I'll leave the last question for Kirk Janes. So, and I say this initially as an editor and publisher, he asked, you mentioned Vasily Grossman. Would you read an excellent historical fiction like Life and Fate before a purely historical treatise like your new book, if you're new to new to wanting to learn about this? I think you'd say your book.
Well, you caught me out. Well, you could read both of them. They've both got different things to offer. Life and Fate, it's a good book. The actual audio of Life and Fate, there's a dramatization you'll find, BBC Radio 4 have done. Kenneth Branagh's in the lead. Absolutely fantastic. It's amazing. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, shall we quickly talk 30 seconds about Lend-Lease?
Yes, of course. Yes.
So one of the things I found out, because like I said, the director of the museum, or one of the directors of the museum, is my age, is the new generation. And he said to me as an aside when I was there, well, you do realize when I was young, when I was 18, I started here, I was working with all these Cold War warriors, academics, and they followed the party line. So in this museum, all the way through the Cold War, we weren't allowed to mention Lend-Lease, we weren't allowed to mention any Allied help. This battle was won by the Soviet Union. And he said, we've got Studebaker trucks, Willys Jeeps, they've been housed around the city in warehouses. We were never allowed to show them. We weren't allowed to show any kind of testimonies because it never happened. And he said, and obviously it happened because the Red Army was motorized by Lend-Lease. The Red Army wouldn't have got to Berlin so quickly if it hadn't been for American trucks. And so that was great to get that from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Iain, thank you. And thank you all for those who attended this conversation. Very, very fascinating and illuminating conversation. You can buy Iain's book if you're in America. Comes out at the end of this month on the 29th. Iain, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.